name is Anja Prumo and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Cambridge INET Institute. I'm talking today to Matt Jackson, who is the William D. Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Matt is visiting us this week and we'll take the opportunity to talk with him about some of his work. The first question I would have is, what do you think is the role of networks in economics?
That's a broad-reaching but a very important question, and in particular, I think part of the reason that there's been an enormous growth in network research in the past decade or so in economics has been that there are so many of our relationships that are structured in some way, and those structures have implications for the way that people form opinions, that they make choices in their lives, what information they have access to. So who our friends are make a big difference in what opportunities we have. It's also becoming increasingly obvious that we need to understand networks and understanding how the interaction of firms might lead to amplification of financial shocks, for instance, and how that might cause problems in an economy, in understanding how it is that we might prevent wars and foster peace, what kinds of alliance structures matter, and how countries can leverage things, how people share risks. So there are just so many different applications where it becomes very obvious that understanding social structure is important. I think that has led to a real growth in the study of networks. Whereas, it's historically, I guess, economics was a little bit more anonymous and market-based, and sort of opening that black box of how markets work and more generally how people interact and how they form their beliefs and expectations and preferences and how all these things work is sort of the next generation of economic studies, and I think that's part of the reason we're seeing a growth in it now.
So one criticism we face in networks is that oftentimes the exact network structure might not matter that much, as long as we take into account that individuals form groups who are connected among each other. What would you say is a good example of why the exact network structure among individuals matters?
So it's not always the case that the exact structure matters, but I guess in cases, for instance, in understanding financial risk, understanding the exact counterparty risk and understanding who's transacting with whom can be very important. And so not just knowing that there's groups of banks that might be exposed to each other, but knowing which banks are exposed to which other banks can make a big difference in understanding whether the portfolio of one bank its correlation with the market could be a risk for somebody else. I think more generally, one thing that becomes fairly clear when you look at some of these things is another example would be, say, poverty traps. So what do we mean by a poverty trap? We mean that somehow I end up being influenced by the group of people around me, and the fact that, say, they don't have access to job information means that they don't invest in education, and that sort of brings us down. Now, that means that if you have a policy that is say, an affirmative action policy that wants to target specific groups of minorities, it can be important not just to sort of target a group, but actually to target more specifically at individuals who are interacting with each other. And that targeting people who are interacting with each other can actually have more of an impact because of the complementarities in their behaviors, because the fact that one person's behavior affects another, then targeting them in very small groups can be much more effective than just sort of blanketly targeting a larger group. So, it depends very much on the application, whether we need all the machinery of network science or whether, broader insights are useful. But there are certain circumstances where very detailed local knowledge can be helpful.
So quite a bit of your work is also on this social diffusion and learning in networks that you've talked about. Can you give a brief overview of your findings in this field?
Sure. So I think we were very interested in learning in networks because of the fact that it's clear that people hold very different opinions in societies, and sometimes information diffuses very widely, and other times it seems that we end up with either polarization or lack of information, and bad information among individuals. And so I think there's sort of a few different overall insights that come out. And one basic insight is that there's different types of information propagation. And this is some of the work I've done with Ben Golub, tried to make a distinction between information which is just purely idea-based, so I just need to tell somebody that a fact, and they can then take that fact and tell somebody else, as opposed to something where we really need to form an opinion. You know, is there really global warming, or you know, will the market go up next year? These are things where there's more nuanced information, and we need to process information. And in situations where you say you have a very segregated society, then the fact that I'm talking to most people who are very similar to myself can have a profound impact in sort of how quickly information spreads in worlds where I have to process complicated information. But idea spreading might not be as impacted by that. And so depending on what kinds of information you have, you could have very profound impacts from homophily and segregation in a network, and in other settings you might not. It's also true that you know, position in network matters a lot, and understanding how to measure people's influence in a network is something that we need to have a better understanding of. And over the years, there's been a lot of research that have developed different measures of influence, and now I think we have better and better data available to begin to understand diffusion processes and information passing, and to track that, and to begin to understand exactly how key individuals can impact a whole society by their actions or their beliefs, and we're getting better and better at identifying how that works and how it depends on circumstances.
You also did an experiment in India on this subject. What were your findings there?
Yeah, so there we were looking at you know, diffusion of a microfinance product in a series of different villages, and we were interested. One of the questions we were interested in was why a bank was getting such different participation rates across different villages, which seemed fairly similar. And part of the answer really lies in the first people that they contacted and how central those individuals were. So in particular, this is a setting where word of mouth is important. And I think, you know, word of mouth is important in pretty much every country or world that we live in, every sphere of the world, whether or not it's we're using the internet actively and have cell phones and are literate, or whether we're in a poor village and basically just work by word of mouth. But essentially, one of the findings there was that talking to the right individuals in a village made a big difference in whether or not news spread. And that's probably not surprising, but what is true is that what the right individuals are doesn't just correlate with their position. So just talking to a leader in a village, somebody who might be really central in our imagination in terms of, say, a shopkeeper or a teacher or other forms of leaders, they're not always the most central person in the network sense. And so being able to identify people in a richer sense, which takes into account how well connected their friends are and what their positions in the network, identifying those individuals can really make a big difference in getting news out. Even if we're talking to several individuals at once, it really has an impact. And so that was one of the findings that we had there.
Is this also something that policymakers can profit from?
Yes, indeed. So I think, you know, we always have to be cautious in interpreting our research for policy, because it's very difficult in social sciences to infer causation. And a lot of the research we do isn't necessarily done in a completely controlled environment. But nonetheless, policymakers have to make decisions, and in this case, you know, people are trying to improve diffusion of microfinance, for instance. You know, then they can ask, okay, well, how do we identify these individuals? And that actually, interaction with people with policy questions in mind sort of prompted us to go back into the villages and say, okay, look, you know, the bank isn't going to have information about who the most central individuals are. They can't map out the networks. So how do we give them that information? And actually, people themselves have a lot of information about the networks that they live in, and they can identify central individuals, and simply asking people who's a good person to diffuse information actually has a remarkably, seems to have a remarkably accurate return to it. And so there can be ways in which policymakers can take simple knowledge of networks and improve things. More generally, I think it's clear now to, say, financial regulators that they need to understand the interaction patterns to figure out who really is too big to fail and where the real dangers in the society lie in terms of potential problems with investments and moral hazard problems and other kinds of issues that economists worry about all the time. And understanding the network structure is important, and giving them the tools with which they can begin to do that in a more, I guess, a deeper and more sophisticated way is important. So I think there's a lot that we can take from network science that can be taken to policy fairly easily, and it's obviously we always have to be careful with any tool, but it's a tool that should be in their toolbox and used with the appropriate caution.
Okay. Another direction of questions. Basically, what are new directions in the research on networks?
So I think one of the exciting things that's happened recently in the research in networks is that we're seeing more and more research that is becoming directly applied. So a lot of people in development economics are using networks and network tools to better understand what's going on in the societies they're looking at. And I think that's an obvious one just because there's so much interaction in developing societies that are done by word of mouth and affect beliefs and ultimately affect the success and failure of different programs. But also the recent financial crisis has awakened people to the fact that the world is becoming increasingly interconnected in terms of financial transactions and business transactions, and that causes a more direct and immediate and quick diffusion of shocks throughout the world economy. And that's something that we have to understand and be able to react to and possibly prevent from going in directions we don't want it to. So that there's development economics, we see financial economics, international trade now is becoming increasingly aware of the fact, I think they've always been aware, but now beginning to use tools from network science to try and track world trade patterns to better understand those. Labor economics has always used this. And I think for any particular area of study to ultimately have a lasting impact, and it has to be that there are important lessons that are learned from it and can be taken to different areas of the science, and in this case of different applications. And so I think that's one really exciting area of growth. There's also areas directly within the study which are very important. So it's becoming important now for us to develop statistical models for estimating networks and for doing a better job of understanding how to estimate the formation of networks and their impact and so forth. And the tricky part is the fact that no longer are bilateral interactions independent. We now have a whole society where everything becomes dependent on each other. And usually, statistics works off the fact that we have enough independent observations that gives us a lot of confidence in what we're seeing. And so I think one area of interesting methodological study is developing models that can be taken to data and estimated well, and that give us understandings of the underlying network structures. So that's a methodological area that's quite exciting. And I think ultimately that sort of feeds into more structural models that can be used in understanding things like peer effects. So, traditionally peer effects have been studied by looking at some individual's behavior and then treating some group as the independent variable in some ways, but there's obviously a lot of endogeneity there. And so understanding and modeling directly how are those interactions working? Is it through information channels? Is it through emulation? Is it through role modeling? Is it through peer pressure? Is it directly through goods or wealth transfers? There's all kinds of different ways in which peer effects work. And understanding and unraveling some of those and putting them directly into models that involve network interactions allows us to have a lot more power. So there's a whole series of areas where you see, I think, very useful and exciting growth. And you put this together with this explosion of data that we've had, which is a bit daunting actually, right? The internet provides email data. Now we have various social site data. We have, lots of social media. We have information which is coming out of cell phone interactions, and then we have abilities to track individuals' movements and their interactions in different platforms at the same time. So we have all kinds of information that's out there. And now this is also being coupled with all kinds of economic behaviors, what products people buy. And so there's not only an interest that's coming out of the academic side, but I think also you're seeing more and more companies be interested in how on earth can we take advantage of all the information that we have regarding our consumers and their behaviors and their interactions with other consumers and their influence on other consumers. And so this has become a quite active area, partly because of the explosion in data as well. So overall, I think it's a very exciting set of questions that are being looked at these days, and sort of an open playground for social scientists in general.
So my last question would be about something completely different. Can you give PhD students and young researchers any advice of how to become a successful economist and to publish in top 5 journals?
Okay, no, it's a tough question. So I think something I always tell my students is that they should really follow their nose in the sense of really doing things that they're passionate about and they find the most interesting. So what the market wants or what people are looking for is very difficult to put your finger on, and trying to produce research that you think other people are going to be interested in often is a dangerous road to go down, and instead really working on the questions that you find fascinating it is the best way to finding original and interesting research. And research takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, and it has to be something that you really enjoy. And naturally, somehow, your own curiosity will lead you in the right directions. And I think, it's constantly questioning the world around you. Actually, I think one of my idols, Ken Arrow, is probably one of the most curious people I've ever met. Just asking questions all the time about everything, and just being curious your whole lifetime about why is this true, why is that true, questioning everything, and then following up on the questions that you don't get good answers to, I think is probably one of the best ways to just have fun and do well while you're having the fun. So don't worry too much about the end results, and you'll get there.